Hey, fellow GNTers, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. Daniel was giving me this grin, trying to see if he could fuck my shit up.
Nah, you're good.
You do it every week. All right. We're in the midst of like our next subject matter, which is really talking about cults. And it seems to be to a very timely and really important conversation to our eyes, to our minds. I can say honestly, I'm not especially interested in cults overall. And I know we talked about it last week, Daniel, but when I was like kind of prepping my side of this, I didn't remember. Do you find it interesting at all? Or,
That's why we're doing it.
well, no, but like the David Koresh's and the Jonestowns, do you find that subject matter interesting?
Yeah, from a psychological perspective, for sure.
Okay, say vaguely interesting. Okay. I'm like semi interested in that, but that's actually not, you know, our main thing. It's more because it seems like now in the world we're living in this kind of deadly web of cults
Yeah.
controlling everything, and it's pretty dangerous times in the sense that it's really dominated by cults. So we wanted to explore that. But before we do, speaking of dangerous webs,
Oh,
I'll ask you to do the thing that everyone asks at the beginning of every video, which is to like, subscribe, do the things. So you can help our little GNT podcast get out of the dangerous webs of the evil arachnoid like algorithm that wants to entrap all of us when its webs find us. So if you can do that, that would be great. Always helps out every podcast that you ever watched in your life to ask you to do it because it'll help with the algorithm. And we all need to liberate ourselves from the evil spider-like webs of the algorithm. But to our episode then. Um, so I mean, I was just gonna like we did the other episode, but just like I thought context for it, it seems then important to look at sort of the psychology behind cult mentality or something like
yeah.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And especially what makes people vulnerable to that kind of thinking because people seem to be vulnerable to this, right? And then maybe in the end, as we go along each episode or however it plays itself out, but we'll also talk about the spirituality of this.
Yeah.
And then hopefully how spirituality with a twist can help break us out of this. It's, I do see like it's weird when I was doing the psychology of this, I was like, yeah, we really are trying to do something about this in our own little small way,
Sure.
making a contribution. But how spirituality can break us out of all this individually and then maybe hopefully ultimately collectively too. All right, so I was kind of putting together stuff on the psychology of this. Daniel and I talked about it, and I did look at like kind of textbooks on sociology, textbooks on social psychology. It's interesting because I looked in the index of these things, like I had these sources, and there really isn't that much form. As we said last time, there's not really formal definitions of cults or like official formal positions about cults that you find very easily. It isn't like a formalized thing for what I've seen with this. Someone else has any more information about that, but I'm not finding it. So it's not a formal definition thing. But I went to sources that were social psychology things and sociology things. I wanted to give a specific credit to one of the people I use for this, though, which is the Dr. A.J. Marsden for her approach to this. Because I thought it was simple and straightforward. She really kind of highlights three big ideas behind like the psychology of cults. And I thought, well, that's really kind of direct and to the point. But on the other hand, it's like what she does is also very kind of deep in the psych literature. So it's not like oversimplified either. And she's really tapping into ideas that you kind of can recognize if you know the psych stuff of what she's saying.
Sure.
So, anyways, want to give a shout out to her. Yeah. She was in this place called Beacon University, which I'd never heard of, or Beacon College, maybe. And it was interesting because it's directed to students with learning disabilities and ADHD. And she's giving a lecture in a way that's kind of designed for that audience. But when I was listening to it, I was like, no, she's really going for this. And she went for some pretty deep psychology in it. So, anyways, just to get props out, to someone that I sourced around this. So, anyways, yeah, our idea is like I'll throw the ideas out to you, Daniel. I'm interested in your opinions, and
Yeah.
then we'll kind of like take it apart as we go,
Yeah.
right? Um, okay, so the perspective on this in this way of thinking about it boils it down to three main ideas. And I think maybe in this conversation we'll just end up focusing on the first one because there's a lot to say about each of these
Mm-hmm.
and their deep subjects. But she has like kind of three ideas, and I thought, well, this is great. So the first she lists is this idea of the problem of conformity. Now, these sounds like these are just normal, everyday English words, but actually they're being used in kind of like technical ways because there's a kind of a social psychology of conformity and what that means from like a social psych sense. So we all know the
Mhm.
word, but they're using it more like a psych concept.
Mm.
So the psychological concept of conformity and research around it. With that, to me, as far as a cult goes, I think that gets to the idea of conformity and like a shared ideology too,
Yeah.
which is something we talked about last week, right? We were kind of introducing the whole idea of what we're trying to be up to here.
Yeah.
And then she talked about this thing called social cohesion, which almost sounds like it would be saying the same thing, conformity and social cohesion, but it's not because it's being used in kind of a technical way. So this is going to be kind of deep stuff. We're going to go for it too. We probably won't talk about these other two in this episode, but we'll get to them, whether we do this over like 2 episodes or 3 episodes or something. But the social cohesion thing is a little bit like a sociology concept, and it has to do with how you build, again, like solidarity within a community, a little bit different even than conformity, and some different theory around that. So we'll throw it out for people to think about. And then the last of this gets this idea, and she said it interesting. She said charismatic or divine power, meaning it could be a charismatic leader, or it might be just sort of like a charismatic oligarchy of people at the top, or a charismatic sort of hierarchy or something, with also the idea of like charismatic power behind it, or divine power, where you're sort of saying that there's something bigger going on. So it could be in a leader, it could be in a movement. One of the people I was listening to was talking about the Jehovah Witnesses,
Hmm.
and she was debating like whether or not that's a cult or not. She definitely thought it was. This is a Dr. Alexandria Stain. She spells it Stein, but pronounces it Stain. So,
Well, we're going to have on somebody, a friend of mine in a few weeks who left the Jehovah's Witness. And actually, Todd, who's been on a couple times with us, grew
mhm.
up as a Jehovah's Witness. I can get a hold of him and they would agree it's definitely a cult,
Yeah,
and
she's
that's
okay. So you've heard that from people who are participants in it.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Because, I think one thing, and I mean, we're going to go over this for sure, but one of the things about a cult, you have to break from it.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what, I don't know if that's it. I didn't see it in the notes that you had here, but like the
It kind of
leaving
comes
of,
up a little bit in the end or something, how you start to make space to get out of it. And
yeah,
like
it's
from
like,
the question of conformity, we can look at it from other points of view too. But yeah.
right, yeah, like in a socially, in like social conformity, you have to kind of follow the rules, but there's wiggle room within the rules. You could still be, like in high school, you have emo people dressed in all black and dark, but whatever, like they're in their own kind of mini thing within the culture still. But they don't have to break from culture. You could just stop listening to like death metal, and move over to like grunge. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a less thing. Whereas, but like you can't be in the cult like a little bit. You're either in it or you're not in it. There's,
Well, this is the part that really interests me because I'm like we both have our own perspectives on this, but I'm very
yeah,
interested in like the layers of difference between like cult, Jehovah's Witness, and then other aspects of conformity. Like I'm really kind of fascinated
sure,
by it.
sure,
So yeah, but it's obviously like if you're in a real small little subculturally cult like that, cult qua cult, you might say, right?
yeah,
Technically a cult, that's its own thing, right? Yeah, and how you
right.
get
Well,
out
and
of
that's part of it too, right? It's the isolation.
it.
So
Hmm.
you can't be like, you can't be like a part-time Mennonite.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Don't work like that. Like you can't be a Scientologist on the weekend. Like,
Yeah. Well, hmm, yeah, the Scientology one. We'll play with it, right?
yeah, for
We'll
sure.
both have these things. I don't know, like from that point of view, sort of interested in cults from that more narrow point of view. And I'm interested in hearing people's experiences for
Yeah,
sure,
yeah,
right? But I'm also kind of fascinated. Well, we'll do the psychology conformity
yeah,
and we'll
yeah,
take
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right. Yeah, and we'll see what we think.
yeah.
Anyway, she put this idea of conformity, social cohesion, and then this sense of like a charismatic leader or divine power. Oh, the reason she was talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, and I guess we'll hear from the people that know it in this way, right? That
Mm-hmm.
participate in it, was that there probably was a charismatic leader in the beginning, but it's not the case now.
Right.
but the energy of that sense like continues on or something, right?
It's like
Even
a
though the charismatic
kingdom.
leader isn't gone or something. Yeah,
It's like
is
a
gone.
kingdom
Yeah,
in a sense, you know?
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they what is it? I mean, it hasn't really held up so well, but you know, the one of the sociologists of fame of lore from the Middle East, Ibn Khaldun. If you're
Mm.
a sociologist, he's a famous kind of a guy in there. Four generations is what he says, right? The first generation that rises, and then their progeny, their progeny, their progeny is the last one. After that, it is something different, you know?
Oh, so when you get a group like that, eventually it like just spreads and it like it won't carry through the generations. Eventually, it starts to become something
Yes.
else.
Yes. Yes.
Mm.
Yes. But the difference is that like at that time, resources were money, money were resources, all of which had to be continually acquired.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas money is now a little bit more static. You can increase money with generations as opposed to decrease it. And so I think it maybe, I don't know if it works as well, but I'm not completely well versed in his. I've had one course on sociology, and he
Mm.
was kind of like the main focus of it. So, but anyways,
Interesting.
I
Mm.
digress.
That's cool. Well, the thing that struck me about this was that you can have a leader, and then that could be the charismatic power in that, or within a movement. So we were kind of talking about that last episode, and I don't mind saying this, and Daniel can take whatever attitude with this that he feels right with, but I don't mind talking about the Elon cult. I think that's totally fine. I think it's fine to say
Yeah,
that that's a cult.
that's a
So
cult for sure. Yeah,
that's a cult. And so, you have this divine leader, you have like that kind of thing. Or like, and I don't mind saying it too, like the Trump cult,
for
that's a
sure.
cult,
Yeah,
right? And it was interesting as I was doing some of the research around this, I went to listen to some of the Christians who sort of pulled away from that,
oh, all
within
three of
those
them.
Christian circles.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I only got to two of the three. I got one more listen to
got
go.
one more to go. All right, that's cool. Yeah,
One of the guys was David French, who I guess he's a known person, and I can't remember the other guy. I kind of like him, like to the extent that he's very honest, and he was part of the Southern Baptist Council or something. I get the dude's name later. But anyways, it was interesting because this idea of charismatic or divine power, like
yeah,
in our Elon episode, there was all this like overarching transcendent. I'm going to save humanity, preserve the
absolutely.
species, preserve the consciousness, get us out in the solar system, and every
Yeah,
fucking Star Trek thing you can think of. You know, so there was that side of it, and then within the Trump cult, it was interesting listening to them because they're like, there's this whole subculture of like prophecies now
yeah.
around him, and then this weird logic of almost like he's so unlikely that isn't that what God would do? He's such a paradoxical figure. He's such an unlikely savior figure
Mm.
that it must be true.
Maybe unlikable is
Yeah,
better
a
described.
whole shooting match.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the more he's an asshole,
Mm-hmm.
the more unlikely he is, the more the prophecies flow.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, 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 yeah.
I didn't like put the term in here from the psych literature, but there's this thing called cognitive dissonance,
Hey,
where like once you're in, you tend to rationalize things.
yes, you do.
And so this idea that like, okay, well, these prophecies are things that are built around, this cognitive dissonance thing psychologically.
It's required, actually, Eric.
Yeah. But it's interesting because they were just talking about like, okay, now we're in this circle of people who we thought were our fellow Christians. We were in the same space. And now we realize, oh no, we're not. And
Mm,
they're kind of going, I think from their own perspectives, they're going, oh, cult. And they're trying to back away from it. And a lot of pressure. I'll kind of maybe reference some stuff as we go, but a lot
sure,
of weird pressure,
sure.
right? So just to like kind of make it clear, and I don't know how you feel about this, Daniel, but just to make it clear that we're not just being like lefty people,
No,
by saying this, I think it's just objective. I think we're just trying to be objective. And it's fair to say that there are left and right wing cults. It doesn't have to be all on one side of a
yeah,
political spectrum.
yeah,
It's totally fine, right?
yeah.
Even that Dr. Alexandria Stain I was talking about earlier, she has a whole thing where she talks about her experiences being in kind of a left wing political cult. where it was built around like political action and elements of social justice, which could be good things, but it was
Mm-hmm.
sort of culty, right? And she got kind of stuck in it, and
Yeah.
like her life got more and more kind of taken over by that. So she has
Yeah.
kind of an interesting tale to tell. Maybe we'll share more about that later. But it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just about like just to criticize people on one side or other of the aisle. And I was remembering back because there was sort of a little line that people would talk about like Obama bots back in the day. People
Mm.
who were so interested in Obama, President Obama, which can respect first black president, and he was an important person,
Mm-hmm.
in the history of the country, and certainly from my perspective, broke years of like again really culty stuff going on.
Sure.
But like it wasn't like everything he did was good, right? And I think
No.
for us, we could say, there's problems. He didn't handle the financial crisis in the right way. It was a weird thing where, and we don't do a lot of political stuff, but
No.
he didn't put people in jail who probably should have been put in jail. It never happened,
Correct.
right? And there's
Yeah.
other problems with that. So it's not to be blind on one side or the other with this, you know, while still acknowledging that like the Elon and Trump things are cults. Anyways, I
Yes.
just want to do the disclaimer. Anything more you think we need to say about that, or that's all good?
No, I think that's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to just be objective about it. To say, hey, this is cult shit. You gotta call it out for what it is,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, I think at any point, if you are, my guess is most of our audience is probably a little bit more liberal leaning, just in general. That'd be my guess. Um, but even if not, regardless of where you sit on the spectrum, if you know, free thinking and criticism of the same side of the aisle that you're on is not allowed or is shamed, you're shamed for it, then you're probably too far in. Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter, right? You're too far in. If Elon is too special to be criticized, you're too far in.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, if whatever, whoever, whatever, there's no figure on the left at this point that is, you know,
Important enough to even talk about.
yeah, exactly. But what, pick your favorite person, I guess. If they're too much, too big or too sensitive or whatever to be criticized, and you find that, people who you normally would share views with are antithetical to even hearing that kind of criticism, then you're too far down that road either. So the goal is to highlight some of these things to free one's thinking. Because for me, and the motivation in bringing this and doing this is that I see this, and we both agree with this. We see this as a problem, as a large problem in society, one that is like, we can call it like maybe a social epidemic, if you will. And in Buddhist practice, they talk about like the suffering of change, the suffering of conditioning, and then the kind of the suffering of like the body aspects, body emotions, But the second one, the suffering of conditioning, is twofold, is the conditioning of the ego, right? That you're an isolated being outside of other humans and other sentient beings is one aspect, but then the sort of meta aspect, it's the conditioning of your family, it's the conditioning of your gender, it's the conditioning of society. And they mention this, and it is, as I do my practice every day, and I know Eric does his practice, every day. This is part of the acknowledgement when you practice, is that you are intentionally softening the hardness that comes through with conditioning that is placed upon you. And so, in this aspect, I feel like this is part of our work as practitioners of these kinds of philosophies, is to bring this forth, to the people who are working with us or listening to us, consuming what it is that we're presenting, to do this consciously. And at this particular point, we are sort of counterculture to the narrative that is being presented by the vast majority of the media and the sort of center right, and then we can argue that point, but the center right leanings of the politics of this country at this time. And
Yes,
and
even center right is kind of, that's being polite about it.
I am
Hybrid
being
right,
polite about it
being
because at
polite
some
about it.
point we're going to start dunking on people, and so I got to start
Yeah.
center and then slowly work my way over. But
Yeah.
we're doing this not from the place of being like specifically political, because there's enough of that that's out there, but being specifically spiritually minded in approaching society as an external representation of our practice. So, yes, it's important to have, um, an ideology, philosophy that you're working with and whatever, but we also have to realize we're not isolated beings. As this is one of the areas of recognition for us, we're not isolated beings and we live in society. So, at some point, something has to be done. What should be done? What is that point? That is not for us to necessarily say, but our goal, and I can speak for myself. My goal is to work with Eric and whoever else is going to be presenting these materials with us to provide the sort of different perspectives from the inside out and then from the outside in to help people see what is going on, see what is happening, and then maybe change some minds. I don't care if I change your vote in particular, but I want to change your mind. I care more about that. A vote is something that you do on one particular day at one particular time, but your mind is malleable. And I believe that to be the case for everybody, more or less for some folks based on age and circumstance and conditioning, right? But overall, I think the people who are listening to this are pretty open minded, and I'm hoping that the conversations that we have, from here for the next however long it takes us to kind of get through all this, is shareable. Shareable in a way that I'm not selling anybody anything. I don't give a fuck, to be totally honest, on who you voted for. I'm looking to the future and trying to like get people to think a little bit differently, to understand what it is that you're stepping in when you say yes. When you put on a blue hat or you put on a white hat. Charlemagne the God one time, a few years ago, said independent thinkers don't wear hats. And I was like, I like that. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to put that right here.
There's kind of an irony in that both of us have these hats, but we'll
But
go
these
on.
hats are black. So, black hats matter.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, there's like multiple sides to it, right? So there's
Yeah.
like the individual side of cracking yourself out of this, right? I think
Yeah.
that's a point
Yeah.
of individual liberation. And then there's a kind of like a social danger that no matter who we are and where we're at, like if there's really like this explosion of this cult mentality, just
Mm-hmm.
dangerous, right?
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know? And well, we'll get as we go. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a little bit disappointing with some of it. I used to, I'm not, we'll drop the politics thing in 1 second, but I used to watch this show called Breaking Points, where it was sort of like a one person who was talking from sort of a right perspective, the other person talking from a left perspective.
Sure.
And one of the things about it was the people who were on the left perspective would be pretty critical of like things on the left.
Sure.
But now that the right side is in power in the United States, these people on the right ain't saying shit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I can't watch this anymore. And it did have to do with the things we're going to talk about, like kind of a conformity.
Yeah.
They can't speak out,
Yeah.
And, anyways, we'll drop the politics of it and we'll get to the psychology of it. But that part, I think, is like, then you could see there's a problem, like what you were
Yeah.
talking about earlier. Yeah. All
And a
right. So,
lot
anyways,
and a
yeah, go
lot of
ahead.
the views that we have, that we hold on things, are counterculture regardless, even if the other side is quote unquote in power. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's the yogis don't live in society. They live in traditionally have lived in the burial grounds, right? And they
Yeah.
cover themselves in ash to say like, I live in the dirtiest part of places and I carry that dirt with me everywhere, and I'm naked and I don't give a fuck. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah. That's
it's
the statement. If you go like the full on, like, yeah.
yeah, it's like it's like we piss on austerity,
Mhm.
like that kind of the conformity. Like, no, 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 no. That is not it. Tantric practitioners are not shamed, not shamed.
No.
Transform the things that other people tell you you shouldn't do, and we transform that. And you say, now this is how it looks like when you make lead into gold.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agreed. And that's why I was so tickled when I was listening to this Dr. Marsden, because the first thing she led with was the psychology and problem of conformity. And I was like, oh man, we talk about this like all the time
Yeah,
because it's such a core spiritual idea. So I was like,
yeah,
okay, totally in my wheelhouse. and it is the social psychology thing to talk about if you're going to talk about cult psychology or cult mentality or whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I guess I'll do psychology of conformity, right?
Hmm.
So, all right. So in social psych, they got these three big ideas. We'll figure out how we want to talk about them as we go forward, but they're all part of potentially like cult psychology.
Yep.
We'll do the conformity one today, depending on time. Maybe we finish, maybe we don't. It's interesting shit to talk about, you
Sure.
know? It's probably like the core idea of this because in any cult, strict cult, Jehovah's Witness or Jonestown or whatever, conformity is a, obviously key point. That's Dr. Marsden's point. If we
Yeah.
stretch this out again, then this can become the problem of this web of cults that seem to be taking over the world, right?
Hmm.
In so many ways. And then, you know, all the different levels of how we have to work individually, like you were talking about, and everything, right?
Yeah.
So the conformity thing is big. Then they have other related psych terms, and I'll probably do like little mini things on them because I think they're interesting to hear the psychology of it. And you know, I think people appreciate that from the episodes that we do when we present the psychology behind the things that we're talking about. So they have another word they use, compliance, which would seem like conformity again, but this is just more how sort of you push people to get to do what you want. So this is how do you
Mm.
elicit compliance from people, right? And the ways that you push. And so we'll do a little mini thing on that because that's kind of interesting to look at, right? Like how do you like request and push people to do things, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then the last one is this idea of obedience, which has a lot more to do with like power and authority and intimidation, you know? So it ends up being conformity, compliance, and obedience. And there's sort of famous psych stuff around this that we can kind of look at as we go. So, all right. But, you know, so, and like, I think from this position, these are all part of what you might call potential cult psychology. Got it.
Hmm. Hmm.
All right. So, starting with the conformity thing, right? The psych definition of this is how do you change people's perceptions, opinions, and behaviors to group norms? So, you know, what's involved in that? And there's a number of kind of famous psych studies that we can talk about with this. Again, when you get people talking about these issues, these are the studies that usually pop up. So I'll lay a couple of these out to you, Daniel, and you can tell me what you think. And so the first of these is this one that's associated with this psychologist named Solomon Asch. These are sort of the Asch studies, and it's interesting. So what he did was he would have people looking at like a sample line, and then you'd give like three other lines, and it was obvious two of the lines were identical. So you'd have one line that would be like the one they would show you. Then they'd show you these set of three lines, and they would ask you, which of these lines is the same length as the one that you looked at over here?
Hmm.
And one would be like the same, and the others would be like obviously different.
Hmm.
And then they'd like, you know, they have the subjects in the experiment, and it was a setup. So the person who was there as the actual subject would be presumably in a perception test or something, they would be told, right? But all the other people that were participating would be, you know, like in on the study, right? They were actually like part of the experiment and they would give like wrong answers to this to put pressure on that person to see whether or not they would conform
Mm.
and agree, like, even though it's obvious that, you know, it's line C is the same as the one that's the sample, whether you could pressure people to say line B or line A when they were obviously wrong.
Hmm.
So that's the Ash study, right? And it's one of the ones that's sort of mainly talked about with conformity and makes sense. So it was interesting when you get to like kind of think how many people do you think would conform? And I guess it depends on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, but you can get people to do it. So when our people are put under that social pressure to say the wrong comparison line, the numbers are interesting. There's like from the studies, 25% of people just won't do it. They won't conform.
I
They'll say
like those
no.
people.
Those two lines, those are the ones. And no matter how much pressure you put on, they won't do it. But
Shout outs to those people.
yeah, yeah. Tip of the hat to the old Solomon experiment people. Um, 50% will conform at least half or more of the time. So just pressuring, they kind of crack.
Betas.
Well, you could say sigmas and betas, right? The 20 sigmas. The alphas are the one are pressuring people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, those are the ones running the experiment.
And then 25% will do it more occasionally.
Mm.
So it's a weird thing when people start to stats because they say 37% when you look at the whole thing. But to me, that kind of almost misses the point of it. If you get 50% of the people willing to do it at least half the time, you know, it's not so great. So really 75% of the people are willing to like, okay, fine, I'll cave to this pressure in some way or another. So that's the famous Ash experiment. And to me, some people will say, well, okay, it's only 30%, 7% of the times, but that kind of misses the numbers. It's 75% of the people are willing to do it.
Well,
Like that's part of the problem, you
okay.
know?
But that number 37, let's just call it a third.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in uh, sociology, in the study of human behavior, there is something, no, or I guess I could call it like even the study of, I know the most hated term now in American politics, diversity, inclusion, and equity, or whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
diversity, equity,
Diversity, equity,
inclusion,
inclusion.
right?
Yeah.
So DEI. In the study of DEI, they have a thing called the magic third.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you're familiar with this or
No,
not.
I haven't heard that phrase.
Yeah. Okay. So Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, The Tipping Point, and then he wrote a follow up to the called the Revenge of the Tipping Point, which I'm reading now in preparation, kind of for this. And so I heard this. So it's an interesting thing. So why this is important. So let's say you have a boardroom. Okay. The boardroom you usually have 9 members. If you have, so it started, like whatever in the 50s and 60s, they might, or maybe probably in the 70s really, or 80s, they would have like a woman on there, your token woman, you
Oh,
know?
gotcha. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So they
Mm-hmm.
have one on there, but then when they started to do research on if she, the impact that she had, it was very low. And many women actually reported that, like during meetings, the men would just completely ignore them, like walk by them. They would acknowledge there's a woman in the room, but they wouldn't acknowledge that the woman had actual, like, autonomy to make her own decisions and be part of the decision making process. But there was a certain percentage of women on these boards that were able to make a difference. Of course, I already said it. It's a third, and they call this the magic third. So it's 3 women on a board of 9,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? There's also some social experiments. One was done in Palo Alto in the 80s, no, sorry, like the 60s,
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you had kind of like a great migration of like African Americans sort of moving all around the country. And a lot of, despite what people think, there was something called the white flight, where when black people would move into the neighborhood, white people would either A, harass them or harm them, or B, move out.
Yeah, yeah.
Like this was a huge thing, especially in large cities. But so Palo Alto, kind of running out of room, purchased some land and built like 24 or 30 homes. And they allowed people to move in, but they kept a very strict ratio. And they never allowed, so they had whites, Asians, and blacks essentially that
Mm-hmm.
lived in this neighborhood. All right, so yeah, 24 homes or 30, but no more than 33%.
Yeah, okay.
Somebody wanted their their cousin to move in. I think it was one of the black members of the neighborhood. And they said, please, they're having a very hard time. They're a school teacher. They work really hard or whatever. The community, which had been in existence already for several years and had good harmony, as sort of other areas were watching this sort of social experiment, voted no.
Uh,
They would. So then that house sat empty for like 10 years
okay.
because they didn't want to go over that magic third. Because when you have 33% of something, then you can get a movement going outside of that. So as you're talking about these numbers, that's the number to think about. And I just want to plant
When
that
you
in.
want to pivot something too, right? This is almost
Yes.
the opposite thing. You know,
Yes.
it's interesting because
Yes.
if it's 25% of the people won't conform, you don't get to the magic third.
Correct.
You have to get that
You
extra
need
8% in there or something, right? To move it
right.
forward. Yeah.
Right. And then we think about the approval rating of our favorite you know, commander in chief
Hmm.
tends to be right around 33, 34,
It hovers. Yeah.
just at that magic line.
Yeah.
Just at that magic line. And there's a reason for that. right? The reason for that is that seems to be the number when you're studying sociology that things change, that things start to tip. That's that what they have found to be the tipping point is about 33%. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyways, I wanted to bring that up because it seemed to fit well there and I've had it loaded in my mind for about a week or so. So
It does fit, and it's interesting because it fits into the 25% thing. If you can't get that more, then shit
hmm
gets stuck,
hmm
right? So you have
hmm
to get that thing up. That's why I think the 37% looks a little misleading in the sense that you need to have people who are like, no, and we'll come back to this issue later on.
Yep, yep.
Because there has to be, whether we do it this week or not, we probably won't have time to do it. But it's a deep subject matter. So I'm glad we're doing this stuff. I think this
Yeah,
is important, right?
yeah.
So to my mind, like some people will say, like, and I think it misses the point because there's a high degree of conformity. And then when you get to further of it, it's only a fucking line that you're talking about.
Right, sure, yeah.
So there's nothing at stake even in this, which on some level makes it more like interesting, right?
hmm
But there's another part of the research around this that just shows that when there's more ambiguity, you don't even make it so obvious. Okay, this is obviously the right line, right? When you start like putting more ambiguity, then people crack even more. So,
hmm
I mean, that's kind of interesting to the subject matter too of how do you break out of these things because the situations are, even when they're very clear, only 25% of the people will draw a solid line and
hmm
stick with what's obvious, right?
hmm
And then you get to the point where if you put it even less obvious, well, then you even start to lose that a little bit.
hmm
So there was another one that like I thought was interesting around this, which is sort of like a thing based on like how people identify colors.
Yes.
And I'll come back to it later on. It's interesting, but I'll do it real quick just to start off with. So it has a lot to do with what we'll get to later on, which is whether or not you're allowed to be exposed to dissent. But they kind of did this weird thing where they had people and they weren't ever exposed to like a dissenting opinion. Like they would ask people, they would flash them something that would be obviously red, and the person would have and people would say it was orange.
Mm.
And they put the pressure on the person, are they going to go along and agree that it's orange? Right. I have the stats later on in these notes, but like when they did it on their own, it was like less than 1%. People would always identify the colors right, you
Right.
know? But once you started putting social pressure on them to do this, especially if there was no dissenting opinions involved, or if there was no previous experience of dissenting opinions, which is interesting too. And we'll talk more about the details of that later. But again, when you look at it, if you had a unanimous group pressing a person, 70% of the people would just go along and misidentify the colors.
Mm.
So, it does give you some idea of like the pressure of this on some level.
hmm
Yeah. Okay, so that's the stuff around the Ash experiment around this, right? And so you get a feeling of what these results are, and we all can think about that for ourselves.
Yeah, yeah.
The other one that comes up is, and I thought that was interesting, it's Musafir Sharif, and he did these studies around the autokinetic effect. I have to like just kind of like talk about this a little bit just because it was interesting to me. It was sort of like I used a standard social psychology kind of text around this, right? Dug it off the shelf. And it's just interesting. Like you were talking about the other sociologist you were bringing up earlier. This is a Turkish social psychologist. And I thought, well,
Mm.
that's interesting, right? You don't always
hmm
get those perspectives from those different parts of the world.
Right.
Grew up in Turkey. He went to the University of Istanbul, eventually got to the United States. But yeah, interesting.
What's the autokinetic effect, Eric?
Yeah, I'll get to it. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
It has to do with this idea. It uses it in the experiment. It's a pretty old experiment, but if you have a dark room and you put like just a little spot of light up, just because I guess how the eye tracks, it'll start to move that around.
Mm.
So it's called the autokinetic effect. I never heard of it outside of this study.
Okay.
It's sort of a weird visual thing. It won't, the dot is still, but the person will start to perceive it as moving.
Mm.
Interesting.
Sounds like something you do when you're high.
It's it's something that you would probably appreciate when you're high.
You're like, oh, dude, well, bro, sick.
Then you'd have synesthesia and you'd hear all these waves as it moved
Yeah.
around. Or like you're on some shrooms and
Yeah,
it
exactly.
has some trails behind it or something. Um, Anyways, it's this motionless dot with this illusion of moving. Okay. So what was interesting in this one, and he was again curious about like conformity in groups, right? So when people were allowed to do it independently, they would report kind of their own experience of the amounts of movement.
hmm
And different people would, I guess, experience this as moving a lot or a little, depending on like, their individual differences of how this appeared to them. So then what he did is he changed it up and he put them in groups. And once the people are in the groups, a weird thing happens. No matter where they were individually, they start to collapse to a standard. So, I would have seen it moving 12 inches or something. By the end, you're saying it's only moving 4 or something. Someone else saw it moving 2 inches. Eventually, they agree. So this starts to build this conformity. In the end, everyone agrees on what it is. So for this, Dr. Sharif, he was like, "Oh yeah, now we're establishing like a norm. It's a very generic thing to do,
Mm,
right? But the point is, it's how human beings get to norms somehow, right? You put a group of
sure.
people together, the conformity starts to build within that group, and in the end, you say, okay, now we've come up with a norm. The weird thing is, even when you take that person out of the group, they still see it that way.
So
So
the damage is
whatever their
done.
yeah, whatever their first perception was, it's gone. And they start to say that they're seeing it like the way the group was seeing it.
Mm,
And the
that's
next
interesting.
trippy thing, what's that?
That's interesting. When was this done?
It's an old one. It's done like in the 30s and the 40s,
That's
but it's
this
held
that
up over time.
that's because it's the next level genius. That's why.
Yeah. Yeah. Get in on the ground floor and do the genius work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the weird part is too, when you would have the people come back a year later, they would do it with the norm again. So
So
it's
the changes
stuck.
it were kind of permanent.
Yeah, it's stuck. So it's one of the studies that's cited around this idea of like how you get people to start to like in that more norm conforming situation to start to like curtail their individual experience to hit a norm.
Mm,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, this stuff is deep.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I think that's a good place to pause for now. I know it's like a
Oh, you want to go? Okay.
cliffhanger
Okay. Good. Yeah. Yeah.
cliffhanger
Yeah.
for our audience, but
And then a high note.
yeah, well, and the next pieces that are coming.
Intriguing note, I guess you'd say, right?
Yeah, because the next pieces that are coming are far more not technical, but they kind of they start to work deeper into it, and I want to leave that I want to have the episode begin there. So that'll be the teaser for next time. So, you know,
Right.
if you guys like the what we're bringing and what we're doing here, then there's more of this to come. And if you don't, then avoid us for the next couple months. So, whatever. Just
Don't do
kidding.
that.
No,
No,
no.
don't do that. It's going to
Come
be
on.
good. It's
Come
going to
on
be
back.
good, y'all.
Yeah, no, this is
By
good.
the end, we're going to see all these dots in our own ways, and we'll be a
Yeah.
fuck you with the lines. I'm calling the lines how I see
I'm
them.
calling it how I see it. The lines are moving, the dots are orange, and I don't give a shit about what anybody else says. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but it's all good. Eric, thank you so much for doing. Audience, thank you for tuning in. As always, subscribe, leave a comment if you feel like that's something that you want to do. Hit us up at ginandtantra@gmail.com. We have an Instagram, the Gin and Tantra podcast. You can slide into our DMs up in there. Check out the little clips that we post. And if you find our work to be useful, please go ahead and share that. We definitely appreciate everybody tuning in, especially to the end. If you are still here, you are in the top like 5% of attention spans of the universe, apparently, at this point. TikTok has infiltrated everybody's last bits of attention and dwindled it down now to mere milliseconds. So, so we appreciate y'all tuning
You wouldn't
in.
even have the time to see the dot move.
No, they're like, what dot?
Click.
Anyways, but
Yeah.
thanks for tuning in, and we'll hope to see you guys here when we do this again. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.